Hey everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. I am Pastor Megan Rohrer, and I'm in my kitchen today because at church they're singing Disney songs again, and they are very expensive to get the rights to. Welcome. If you want to learn more about Grace Lutheran, you can go to www.gracesf.com. And today in Colorado, we have with us...
Hi, I'm Pastor Dan Tisdale. I'm from First Lutheran of Gypsum, Colorado. Gypsum is about halfway between Vail and Glenwood Springs in the mountains of Colorado. We have worship at 9 a.m. on Sunday. A lot of things are going on this week. This Saturday at 10 a.m. we were in the Gypsum Days Parade. Now, many of you will say, well, who cares about the Gypsum Days Parade? It's a little town in the middle of nowhere, but we actually have somewhere around 15 to 20,000 people come to this.
Wow.
8,000 people for the events. They always have a country music artist, and it's usually a pretty big name, like surprisingly big name. And they sell 10,000 tickets to that concert, which in a town that has 8,000 people. So that's kind of like amazing. So it's a crazy fun week. But anyway, we're in the parade with a miniature, our float is a miniature version of the church, and we're giving out ices and meeting people and being out of the community. It's a lot of fun. So that's this week. You can find more about what's going on with us at www.firstlutheranofgypsum.com or First Lutheran of Gypsum, all one word, is our Facebook page also.
That sounds like lots of fun.
Yeah.
Popsicles are fun. Popsicles for the Lord. That's what I always say.
11. We did another parade like 3 weeks ago, and we had 430 popsicles. We ran out more than less than halfway through the parade.
Wow.
We're giving out 1,100 popsicles this week.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah.
One of the things that ties into handing out popsicles is this week's reading. It's the parable of the sower. For those of you who have never heard of the parable of the sower, it's a story about Jesus being like a farmer. And I don't mean that in the sense that I am from South Dakota and members of my family live on farms, because they are farmers who their goal is to grow a lot of crops and to make money. And whenever Jesus is telling a parable about farming, he's not a good farmer by agricultural or capitalistic sense. Jesus is a terrible farmer. And so this is a parable that Jesus talks about farming. And he tells the story of a sower who goes out to sow. It's one of many parables that Jesus talks about with seeds and growing. And other parables about seeds and growing are just as terrible farming as this one. I'll put some links down here to some Bible study. The Bible study that doesn't suck that I've done with my stepdad Dave, who's an actual farmer, and you get to watch his face because he loves Jesus a lot and he thinks anything Jesus says is correct. So you get to watch his face when I tell him parables that Jesus said about farming. And then you get to listen to him tell us why Jesus probably is still correct, even though that's terrible farming. It's very fun, and I will put it down here. One of the worst parables that Jesus tells about farming that is fantastic for our faith and bad for agriculture and capitalism is Jesus talks a lot about whether or not you should sort out wheat from chaff, whether or not you should sort out what is good from what is bad. And in some Bible texts, Jesus says, sort out the bad things and throw it in the fire. But he doesn't do it at the normal time that maybe a farmer would sort things. Jesus talks about, there is a parable where Jesus talks about letting all the weeds and all the plants grow at the same time and sorting it out in the end, right? This is a reference to the idea of end times. The eschatos is the fancy Greek word for that. It really just means words about the end. And Morgan Freeman has a fantastic series where he explores what the end time means in all different kinds of faith. And I'll, if I remember, put a link to that down here. I'm going to write it down to remember. And it'll talk a little bit like more extended about why when Jesus is talking about the end time, it might not be what you think if you've just seen a Kirk Cameron movie about it. Or if you've ever gone to like the Jesus Experience in Orlando, Florida, where Jesus dies every day at noon. It might be a different story than you're expecting if encompassing the entire Bible and the metaphors within the Bible isn't something that you are familiar with. So the reason that I bring that up is because when Jesus is talking about a parable about how good people and bad people are going to be judged, or whether or not people will also have an ultimate judgment that is more just than the laws that happen in our natural world, Jesus sometimes used farming metaphors for it. But if you were to have a garden where you let the weeds grow in the same place as the plants or the things that wanted to bear fruit, the result would not be, yay, everyone gets a fair opportunity, which is what Jesus is talking about. The result would be that there is no nutrients in the soil enough to feed any of them. Everyone dies, right? So if you look at this metaphor from a pure, like strict agricultural sense, it's a terrible metaphor, right? When Jesus says, let the weeds and the wheat grow in the same field, it's the equivalent of saying, well, if not enough percentage of people are graduating from high school, why don't we just make the test easier, right? Let's just lower the bar so that everyone can jump over the hurdle. And what happens is that people aren't able to like be their best or succeed or have the sustenance of life. So if we took Jesus's agricultural metaphors seriously, all the plants would die and you would make zero money, right? So know that there is a long history of Jesus telling stories about growing food, about growing plants, about what to do with weeds that are more about justice than they are about planting or gardening. Got it? We're all on the same page there? Does that make sense? Great. So Jesus tells this story that we're going to study on Sunday about a sower who goes out to sow. A sower is not making quilts in the church basement. It's a process of planting seeds. So when you use a plow to dig a hole in a straight line, that's plowing. A sower would be someone who plants the seeds by hand. And typically, if you were going to do that, almost everyone in the world would poke a hole with a stick or with their hand, and they would put the seed exactly where they want it to go. In this story, Jesus's farmer grabs into his bag a handful of seeds and flings them, right? So God is a terrible farmer. God is a terrible sower. So this is not the parable of the sower. This is the parable of the terrible, no good, horrible, rotten sower, right? So we have the parable of good seeds. And there's a story that Jesus uses to talk about people who he's really mad at in front of their faces about how he's mad at them. And the parable he uses is that some seeds go into good soil, and those seeds grow and they are amazing. Yay, good soil. Other seeds go into like rocks and they can't make roots and then they die. Other seeds go into like the desert and they don't have enough water, right? So it's this long parable about how it's not God's fault if you turn out terrible. God gave you the seeds and the things that you need. It's up to you to surround yourself with nutrients and to surround yourself with good soil, right? So this is kind of a continuation of that parable. God, the terrible planter, flings seeds everywhere, and some go in the rocks and some go in the desert and some just go all over the place. Like this is, you have to imagine, not only is this person not poking holes and just putting a plant in, like they must be just like how my kids eat lunch. Right? When my kids eat lunch, like yesterday, they were holding a taco. And they'd hold it over the table, because if you hold it over the table, then when some falls out, it falls on the table and it's easy to clean up. My kids are like, look at the clock! Look over it. And they gesture with their taco, right? And cheese is all over the kitchen at the end of their time eating. this sower has to be like that. It's not even just flinging, like, because if I threw a bunch of seeds towards good soil, I'm not going to get them planted the perfect 5 inches apart that the planting packet might say, but they're at least going to go in good soil. This is a sower who goes out to sow and is just like, hey, look, a squirrel. And some get in the rocks and some get in all over. Like, there is no way you can take anything from this parable other than the person who's planting is the problem.
The blind. They're blind.
Exactly. It makes no sense, right? So if you are going to use this parable to say that it's people's fault that choices they make later in their life are the reason that God can't choose to love them, you have a hard time doing that with this parable. It's possible that this parable of the sower is a lot like the book of Job. The book of Job outwardly questions, is God responsible for any of the injustice that happens in the world? And if bad things happen to good people, is it the planter's fault? So you could start at the beginning of this parable and say, God is a terrible sower. We're doing the best we can with the seeds we've got because God is a terrible sower. Right? So that's one way you could like read into this text. Now let's talk about how we live in a complicated, messy world where God just throws seeds around and doesn't know anything about farming. It's interesting. Can you imagine if you told that story about how the world was created instead of like, and then 2 by 2 they came off a boat and they were neatly organized, right? So this is the opposite of what's happening in creation where everything is sorted neatly. This is God flinging, right? The other thing that happens in these parable texts is the idea that miraculous things can happen from people you never expected. Now, Jesus was known to hang out with prostitutes and sinners and tax collectors, everyone you would assume could never produce anything, that could never be good fruit and could never bring anything back to you. And so this sower ends up being a mad genius, right? Who is able, like the other shifting way to look at this story of the sower is to think of it as the cotton gin guy. Who's the cotton gin guy? John Washington Carver?
Eli Whitney.
Eli Whitney. Okay. Carver was Peanuts, right?
I think so, yeah.
I'm thinking of the Peanuts. John Washington Carver. So he discovered like 300 ways to do peanuts. Is that the right guy?
George Washington Carver.
George Washington Carver. Okay. Dyslexia is not my friend this morning. But so the guy who invented 300 different ways to come up with peanuts. Imagine the sower is a genius like that, right? God invents new ways to plant seeds and to find faithful people in the world. And so our original way of looking at it, God's a terrible farmer. But now God is a mad genius because God finds people who are faithful in the most unexpected places, right? God discovers that succulents exist and can grow in rocks. And nobody knew that before because we only thought priests and bankers and respectable, upstanding people were the good people of God. If you were rich, that meant that you obviously must have had God's favor. But what Jesus is doing is talking about a God who is a ridiculous sower who casts the nets super wide and discovers that through this outreach that is uncontrolled, unplanned, and is flung way farther than anyone could ever imagine or call it church or outreach, has surprising results where things grow and are loved and named and claimed. And how cool is that, right? So terrible farming, but it also brings us through this same journey that the book of Romans and the book of Galatians takes us through, where it starts with, we hate everyone. We need to judge who's good and bad. We need to know if this will work before we even try it. And then at the end reminds us that God's love is bigger and wider and deeper, and that you get God's love even if you didn't follow any of those rules that you thought you should have to follow in the first place. So how dare you judge and say that God should be a good farmer when God's a genius who can come up with 300 different ways to use the peanut.
Well, I also think
Anyway.
it's about the analogy, like what is what. This I like this parable a lot because it's one of the few that Jesus goes into great detail to explain. Like sometimes as preachers we get these parables and people are like, what does that mean? And somewhere in my head I say, I don't know, but I'm going to make an estimate. Jesus goes into great detail about what this means, because I love the fact that the disciples most of the time don't understand, and so he's kind of I picture Jesus looking at them going, okay, here, since you didn't get the parable when I told you, here's what it means. Like he's almost exasperated sometimes with them, which I appreciate, because I need an exasperated Jesus to help explain things for me sometimes. But I think that so he says that the seed is the word of God, and I like the idea of God spreads the seed to everyone. But I think there is also some responsibility on our part to receive it, and so some of it is not that God doesn't love everybody. God does love everybody, but we also have to make sure that we're doing our part to prioritize our life the right way. Sometimes, like I see so many people. We were talking about this at my church, that they're just too busy to call that person who's in the hospital, or to volunteer an hour at church, or to just simply smile at somebody and visit somebody, to talk to a neighbor, whatever it is that means to preach the gospel. And I said, to me, that's the weeds and the rocky ground. You have the time, you're just changing your priorities. The last month and a half, we had five weeks in a row of basically, it was the mission discourse in Matthew 10. It was like, what does it mean to be a disciple? And I love that this follows that. Because we had 4 weeks of very detailed, like, this is what it means to follow Jesus. This is what it means to be a disciple of Christ. And then now we have this, and it says, so where do we start with that? We have to be willing to be good soil. We have to prepare our field, our spiritual field, to accept the seed. It's not that God isn't spreading seed all over, but a lot of people, even in churches, are sort of, I'm too busy to actually do the stuff that you're saying in church. I've got too many other, I've got fields and commitments, it costs a pretty sum. Anyway, break some kind of rule, like the Disney song rule. Anyway, okay.
No, we have the rights to church stuff.
Okay, good. So I in a way I love this, but then the question is, yeah, the grace is freely given, but do we have to do anything for that grace? And we say no, but there is something about the grace is given, whether we prepare ourselves for it, and whether we prioritize it, whether we accept it. There is kind of a choice, and that's can be a sort of a slippery, tricky subject. Like, oh, it's free for everybody. Does that mean does everybody have it? And the answer is actually no, because you can have it, but you have to be willing to have it. You have to grab it. And I
think God's love is more of a nanner poo poo. You get it even if you don't grab it.
Maybe, yeah.
Nanner poo poo. It's one of those weird things, right? Like there are a plethora of texts that are like, you have to do something in response in order to be able to like take it in and receive it and give it good soil. And then there's also an equal number of texts that are like, it's a great mystery and everyone gets it. And there are members of my flock that aren't going to make any darn sense to you. And so it's a weird. That's part of, I think, what happens because of the flinging, right?
Right.
The flinging of seeds wherever they go.
I think you can die of thirst lying next to a river. Like I agree that the river is there, the seed is there, but there's nothing more frustrating to me as a pastor than to see people who have this gift in front of them, and I don't mean the gift. They've already got the gift of grace, but to take it the extra step and to say, now, am I going to let this grow in me and share it with the world? And they don't. So maybe I need to turn. What do they do with that crop? That crop that grows?
Right. What do you do with the seeds? How many of the seeds do you consume, and how many of the seeds do you fling, right? And I love the popsicle that you are giving away, because so often when we think about like sharing God's love or being out there about our faith in the world,
popsicle.
You got to talk in order for the popsicles to be visible.
Popsicles. Woo. These ones aren't frozen yet.
Yeah, so when we think about sharing God's love in the world, a lot of people think, well, I could never do Bible study, or I don't want to talk about Jesus. I don't want to say any of that stuff. And there are people who have very secretly for a long time, like, lived their faith out by like feeding people, and then they never talk about their faith with other people. And then there have been people who would say, yeah, but you could have talked about your faith, and why didn't you, and you missed an opportunity. And so sometimes when we fling seeds or popsicles or fling things in the air, there's always something inside of us that makes us wonder if we did it right or good enough. And it's so hard to know when people are open to talking about God out loud and when they're not, particularly in this time when society is very anti-institution. Like, people would feel more comfortable riding in a car with a stranger or staying in a hotel at someone's house, like Airbnb. There are people who trust Airbnb more than a hotel nowadays, because our ideas about organizations and institutions being terrible is the opposite. It used to be don't trust strangers. Now it's don't trust organizations. And so it can be very hard to try to share your faith, particularly if you're from a denomination, or if you are from a collection of churches, that people can talk about what's good and what's bad, or ethics in general. But when you start to say, yeah, but I go to First Lutheran in Gypsum, people can wiggle in their seats and get a little nervous. But there are some people who are like desperately longing for that. When I did my doctoral research on LGBTQ homeless folk in San Francisco, I discovered in surveying the homeless people who were eating at Lutheran meal sites, being fed by faithful people, they not only felt safer going to churches to eat, they kind of longed for the church people to talk to them more about their faith. And 86% of people wished that the people at the Lutheran meal programs in San Francisco would give them opportunities to talk more about their faith. And if you surveyed the people who were running those food programs, they'd assume that they did not want that. And they were trying to respect people by not talking about their faith. And I'm not saying we should, force things down people's throats. I'm just thinking we should get more creative about it. And in our flinging of seeds, Jesus is intentionally using a fertility metaphor, by the way, which can be problematic in our contemporary church, where there are problems with sex abuse, and there are problems with people flinging their sexuality or flinging their sexual harassment at people who are not wanting it. And so I want to state really clearly that, yes, this is a fertility metaphor, but we have good boundaries in our church, and it is up to us to continue to have those good boundaries. But I love this idea that we can not just like give people a Bible, but we can have really creative Jesus books, that we can give people a Tolkien movie. They can learn about like lions and tigers as a way of finding out about Jesus. They can get popsicles. They can come to a giant rally and be a part of a prayer when there's a big disaster and someone's praying. They can be a part of Bible study that doesn't suck online. They could get peanut butter and jelly sandwiches handed to them. Like, when we're talking about flinging, what I want to encourage people to think about is not just assuming what happens on Sunday in a church space is the only faith options, is the only evangelism options, is the only ways that we're going to invite people into talking about God, but to think about those mission activities. Because my congregation has grown by 12 members, and nearly every single one of them has joined our church because they saw me speak at an event about feeding people. They noticed that we were doing justice activities, and that made them more curious to want to see what happens in our space on Sundays. And so I just want to lift that up to people, that mission is evangelism, and doing good things in the world is one of the ways that we continue this bad agriculture, where it makes no sense for the bookkeeper to go and spend money on stuff that looks like it's not about Sunday mornings. But this is in the spirit of the sower, where we fling willy-nilly different ideas because God wants us to and told us to.
So maybe we're not only the field, the keeper of the field, but we're also the sower, because that's like what I said earlier about sometimes I think people believe that it's the job of the pastor to be the preacher. And in terms of Sunday morning, yeah, we preach on Sunday morning, but we are all called as disciples to preach the good news, you know, wherever we are. And I think people, like you said, get caught up in, well, what does that look like? You know, I don't want to go stand in the corner and talk about the Bible. And I said, maybe it is giving an icy to someone, or maybe it is helping someone load their groceries, or maybe it's just smiling at someone, or, you know, whatever it is.
Some of the mega churches that I have known about I've been reading their books on evangelism. How do they grow their churches to be so mega? And one of the biggest things they do is they encourage people to care for each other and to do things for each other. So if someone on your block has a death in the family or has a health issue, the pastor will say to you, why don't you mow their lawn? Like, it's not about talking about God to them. It's about doing something that makes that person's life better. And if that person wants to say, hey, why did you mow my lawn? Then you say, because I'm a Christian and I go to this church and that's a part of what we do, right? It's not about aggressively trying to shove faith down people's noses. It's about legitimately wanting to help people make their lives better. And it's not showing up and mowing their lawn without their consent. It's saying, would it be helpful to you if I mowed your lawn? Would it be helpful to you if I watched your kids for a couple hours while you're at your doctor's appointment? Would it be helpful for you if I was able to take your dog on walks for you because you can't do that? And finding, like, it doesn't have to just be like projects of the homeless. It can be anything that helps make people's lives better. Yeah. Sometimes it's easiest. The people who are the most vulnerable might be the most to say yes or no to something. And those who need help and are the most resourced might be the least likely to say yes and accept the help that they actually need. But that's a part of what living out this kingdom of God is to be like family to each other, to be kind to each other, and to share our resources with each other. And I think as much as we want to be good stewards of our times and our talents and the buildings that we have, and ensure that we have enough money in the bank to get things done, if we don't splurge sometimes like the careless sower, live into the fullness of what God wants us to be as generous people. So
I've been really pushing a little hard. I think sometimes one of my preaching professors said, you know, we have there's sort of three directions you go with a sermon. You go care, celebrate, and challenge. And I tend to push into the challenge area maybe too much, and maybe I'm not always as caring as I could be, or celebrating as I could be. But especially the last month or so, I've been really challenging. And we normally have a summer church picnic. A lot of churches do a church picnic. We had our church picnic, and after sort of pushing some people on church council, one of them said, well, what if our church picnic this year was a community meal for everybody that wanted to come? Mm-hmm. And it's not about preaching or even praying before the meal. Mm-hmm. Or we just have music. We're going to get a bounce house.
Yeah, bouncy house.
And it's just, and there's not going to be any program. It's just, hey, welcome. We want to feed you, get to know you. That's it. That's this sower. That's the right. Sower.
That's right.
Because some of those hearts, you know, I had somebody say, well, about these ices, how many people do you think will come to church because of those ices? And I said, maybe none.
Yeah.
They're like, what do you mean? What kind of percentage? I'm like, it's not about how many people come. It's about touching people.
Yeah.
If they see that this church is a caring church, maybe they'll come, maybe they won't. We can have 300 people come to our community dinner, and it's not, yeah, we want to grow. For sure we want to grow. It's not that we don't want to grow, but we got to make sure that we're prioritizing right. It's about being in the community, taking care of people, and if people come then because of that, great. I would rather people come because we cared about people and we served our God by preaching the gospel, not necessarily with words, by handing out ices and by feeding people, by smiling at people, than by dragging them, kicking and screaming, saying, you should come to my church, you know, dragging the door. Because what happens in my experience is that when you, it's not that you shouldn't invite people, by all means invite people, but a lot of times when people are being invited, you put like flyers on people's doors, they may come once, but they may not stay. When you feed people, when you give people ices, and you're not upfront and kind of pressuring them, they're more likely, if they come, to stay, because they're coming for the right reason. They're coming because they see this is a caring place. This is a place that lives out the gospel. That's what we need to do first. We need to live out the gospel first.
That's right. And we don't lose anything by erring on the side of kindness. We don't lose anything for ourselves because we erred on the side of generosity. And we have to stop talking soon, not because we're done talking, but because we will have to kind of move it along. I have a meeting on the other side of town, but I hope that this stirs up your creativity. I'm kind of glad we're ending mid-conversation, because I want you to be thinking about the ways that you can be generous in the world, the ways that you can fling seeds in places they shouldn't go, because let's see what happens. And this world gives you so many diverse ways to do that, through like micro funding online, like through GoFundMe pages, to just being able to send random thank you letters in the postal mail. Can you believe people do that anymore? To Facebook thumbs upping people just because you like them. And so go forth, love boldly, forgive more boldly still, and err on the side of generosity if you can this week. Dan, you get the last word.
I think you did a great job. I'm good with that.
Oh, you did a great job. See, we erred on the side of generosity. Bye, everybody.